I do want to make mention of Maundy Thursday service at 6:30 in the Family Life Center and Good Friday service at 7 o'clock here in the sanctuary. And that's really, really important. Those services are really, really important. It may not be your custom to come out to a worship service during the week. But on the Christian calendar, this is the week above all weeks. It seems like Christmas is that way, but it's really not in the traditional history of the church, in the foundational meaning of the church. This Passion Week beginning today with Palm Sunday, progressing each day of Passover through the glorious occasion of Easter next week. But to reach that glorious occasion, Jesus passed through hell. And that's what we have to be vitally aware of. Otherwise, that empty tomb takes on a whole lot less meaning. Each year I come to this part of the gospel story the same way. I come to it the same way, exactly the same way that I come irrationally, even stupidly, when I watch old television news footage each year of JFK in his limousine wending his way down Main Street, then across to Elm Street, then past the school book depository building. I know perfectly well how that old news film ends, just as I know what will happen in these days after Palm Sunday. I know the endings. But I still wish, that somehow this day the story will go another way. So the Palm Sunday story. As usual, as I read it, I'm reading it today from Luke. I'm going to stop at a few places to point out some details that will bear on what I want to say this morning. And even though the story appears just a little bit differently in each of the Gospels, this is Luke's version. And if we only had Luke's version, we wouldn't be calling it Palm Sunday. We'd be calling it Cloak Sunday or Donkey Sunday or something, because he doesn't mention the palms in the way that the others do. Luke 19, beginning at verse 29. When he had come near Bethpage and Bethany, at the place called Mount of Olives, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it.'" So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they said, "The Lord needs it." Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people keep spreading their cloaks on the road. And he was now approaching the path down the Mount of Olives. The whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." Jesus answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, even the stones would shout out." And we'll stop here, because there's three distinct groups of people here on this day. There are the Pharisees, worried and concerned about all the noise that the disciples are making, worried no doubt that the Roman soldiers may decide to come down hard on all Jews, the Pharisees included, if the noise feels in any way threatening. And then there are the disciples, not just the 12, but others who are following the Jesus-led group around the countryside and now into Jerusalem. And then there is the crowd. This crowd is a little better defined and able to be seen in the other gospel stories. But these are the people who have heard of Jesus, maybe who have come near for a healing or a blessing of the kind that they've heard about him giving out elsewhere. Some of these persons in the crowd, of course, are like the rubberneckers who slow down traffic wherever there's a wreck on the highway. They want to see what's happening. But Jesus is something also of a first-century rock star, after all. So some in the crowd, probably many, are there because they are what we will call admirers of Jesus. So there's the Pharisees, the disciples, and the various members of the crowd. Now Jesus continues responding to these complaining Pharisees. Verse 41. As he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and will hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon the other, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. Now, if we were looking down on this scene from the air, we would see a triumphant, colorful, and exciting scene. But when we get close enough to listen in, as we are here, through these words written by Luke, we realize all is not well. After that seemingly happy-appearing parade day, full of crowds and cheering disciples, we know things deteriorated quickly. 2 days later, Jesus would gather his 12 main disciples in an upper room and tell them what was going to be happening. One of those disciples would betray him. Most of the others would simply and soon be drifting away into the shadows. Jesus would be arrested, beaten, accused by the Pharisees and the Romans of being a revolutionary, an insurrectionist, and tried, in essence, for treason. And then during the trial, looking at Luke 23, verse 13, during the trial which followed, Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, you brought me this man who was perverting the people. You accused him of perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, this Jesus appears to have done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him. Now we know that Pilate, even though at first he came to a correct conclusion here, we know that he had a spine about as strong as a rubber band. If only Pilate had been more courageous. Kind of in the same way, if only Lee Harvey Oswald hadn't been such a good shot. But we know how this crowd, many of the same people who had been to the Sunday parade and who were now gathered in front of the palace steps upon which Jesus was being tried, we know how this crowd reacted to the man that they saw in front of them now. Bloodied, beaten, not putting up any fight whatsoever. Verse 18, the crowd all shouted out together, away with this fellow, release Barabbas for us. Barabbas was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city, and he's also being held for murder. When the going gets tough, admirers are fickle. When the going gets tough, admirers quickly find a new hero to admire. And Pilate gave in, washed his hands of the whole business. And Jesus was led to a cross. And he was tortured some more, a whole lot more. He was taunted, laughed at, nailed, scorned, scourged, stabbed, and finally, blessedly, he died. silly as it is, I still want the story to end differently. I want it to end differently because in some very, very real ways, the story of Jesus Christ continues to end badly. And here's what I mean by that. Look again at that parade day. The Pharisees, the disciples, and the crowds of others. There's only one of those groups that Jesus called to himself, and that was the disciples. And it wasn't just the 12 that we're most familiar with. There are others who were genuinely endeavoring to follow him because following is what disciples do. There were 4 Marys, including his mother. There was Martha and Lazarus. There was Joseph of Arimathea and Simeon, the guy who helped Jesus carry the cross. There were the women who were crying, people like Zacchaeus and one of the lepers and the woman at the well. These were disciples too, followers. There was enough of them that we know them to be making noise enough to concern the Pharisees. So while I don't know exactly how many that were there that day, we can guess easily at several dozen minimum, I think. Even those disciples who didn't stand near the cross until the very end, as at least John and 3 of the Marys did, even those who, like Peter, went away for a while and hid, they came back together the next day, the very next day. They were together that morning when one of the disciples, Mary Magdalene, rushed in to announce that the tomb was empty. The disciples had come back together because that's what disciples do. That's how followers act. They are not part of the crowds that any well-known person attracts. Those are the crowds that look for reflected glory, the people who want to get close enough to get something, an autograph, a picture, a healing touch, a smile, a wave. Those kinds of crowds are admirers. And Jesus didn't call for admirers. He called for disciples, followers. The reason I think the story of Jesus Christ is still ending badly for many people is that there are still so many people who merely admire Jesus. There are a whole lot fewer people who are willing, really willing, to be followers of Jesus. It's pretty easy to be an admirer. It can be much more difficult to be a follower. Admiring Jesus can be done from the comfort of an air-conditioned, nicely decorated living room with good lighting and snacks. Tonight you can admire Jesus on the History Channel at 7 o'clock. It's not hard at all to admire Jesus if you only know him as a miracle worker and as one who emerged from a tomb and ascended into heaven. But if you look a little closer at this Jesus, well, yikes. This guy didn't have a house of his own. He didn't even have a pillow. He ate with low-lifes from the other side of town and was always going out of his way to touch, dead people. And again, people with leprosy and skin diseases and demons and wounds that wouldn't heal. The Pharisees, the popular guys in town, wanted nothing to do with him. The crowds who were always hovering nearby turned on him when he could have really used their support. And then the whole Roman government came down on him. And again, that cross. When you look at the outward and visible parts of this Jesus story, this Jesus character, what exactly is there to admire? And that's why most of the crowds around Jesus then and now are pretty fickle. It's fun and it fills churches, God knows, to entertain people with Jesus. But where are the admirers when there is blood to be wiped away? When there are whole countries full of dying children of malnutrition? Or when the lepers or the demoniacs or the undocumented workers are getting too close? Admirers tend to leave and leave quickly at the first smell of smoke in the air. Followers, disciples of Christ, see Jesus differently. They've responded to his call. They see him, yes, going to places where they have never been before, crossing boundaries that they maybe have always been afraid of. And by themselves, they would still be afraid. But with Jesus and other followers, all things become possible. All things are made new. So followers try. Sometimes they fail, like Peter did, but they try again. Sometimes they give up, like most of the disciples did those first days after the crucifixion, but then they come back together because the love they have found will no longer let them be apart from one another. Even when there is a cross on the path ahead, their own cross, Jesus called it, even then, disciples will continue to follow. It may break their bodies, their bank accounts, old friendships, but followers will follow Jesus because Jesus, they know, will never leave them nor forsake them. I am closer to you than a brother, he assures them. Are you an admirer of Jesus Christ? Or are you a follower, a disciple of Jesus Christ? That's the question I ask you and which I ask myself today. It's the question I leave hanging there because it is exactly the kind of question which hung before the crowds and the disciples this Passover week 1,983 years ago. The parades are over. Pilate has washed his hands and gone home. The soldiers have delivered Jesus to the executioners. And now there is the steely sound of hammered nails echoing across the valley from Golgotha. What are we going to do now? Wash our hands and go home? Or move toward that cross? His cross. Our cross. Amen.